Pull your chair an inch closer to the glow of the screen tonight, because what I am about to lay across this table in front of you is not another music industry squabble your algorithm keeps recycling into your feed. It is not one of those exhausted award show autopsies every commentary channel keeps stitching together out of stolen screenshots. It is not one of those bland reaction videos that scrolls through a tweet timeline and calls itself analysis. What Curtis Jackson has just engineered against Rick Ross across the last 48 hours is a different animal entirely, and by the time we finish walking through every caption, every mansion frame, every whispered rumor, every Tupac wrinkle, every Eminem shadow, and every Airbnb aftershock, you are going to lean back in your chair and understand that 50 Cent may have just executed the cleanest reputation extraction of his entire 20-year run, and that Rick Ross, whether the man everyone calls the biggest boss has clocked it yet or not, has been the one swinging the wrecking ball into his own foundation. Curtis Jackson is not done. Rick Ross is not safe. What leaked, what dropped, and what got captioned across the last 2 nights has completely rewritten the temperature of hip-hop's longest-running standoff. This is the hinge that swings the whole door on how Curtis Jackson and Rick Ross will be remembered across the next decade of this culture. And if you think you have already seen the punchline, I promise you, you have not even seen the setup. Let me carry this piece under the light slowly, because the way every gossip page is packaging this story borders on culturally humiliating. Every legacy blog jumped to the Tupac headline. Every reaction stream jumped to the Eminem hook. Every entertainment page jumped to the mansion punchline. But almost no one is arranging these events in the actual order they detonated. Once you line them up correctly, what you are staring at is not a rap feud. What you are staring at is a long-fuse psychological pressure play. Curtis Jackson is the architect. Rick Ross keeps delivering him the blueprints. Every jab lands sharper than the last. Every clapback from Rosie becomes fresh ammunition. Curtis reloads and fires the following morning. Every single time Rick Ross climbs into the ring to defend his own reflection, he trades a slice of composure for another news cycle Curtis Jackson will squeeze for the next 6 months. Let me set the stage for anyone tuning in fresh. This chapter reignited when Rick Ross rolled out a brand new album. A project Rick Ross had been personally hyping for months. A project stacked with more than 20 features. A project he framed as a career statement piece. A late career declaration that Rosie still ran Miami and every mile of coastline attached to it. Rick Ross walked into that release with billboards, with press stops, with the entire Maybach mood board turned up to widescreen. Then the first week tracking landed, and depending on which outlet you trusted, the number came in somewhere in the low 20s of thousands. That is not a soft opening. That is a public bruise. That is a bruise the internet screenshots and passes around. Curtis Jackson, who has treated Rick Ross trolling as a creative discipline since roughly 2005, wasted 0 seconds pouncing. Within hours, the memes were live. Within a day, the reaction podcasts had lit their candles. Within a week, Rick Ross was trending for reasons that had nothing to do with the album's music. And this is where the sequencing matters, because every hour Rick Ross spent trending for the wrong reason was another hour Curtis Jackson spent tightening the frame around him. But now, watch the angle shift. Instead of firing back with numbers, instead of releasing a diss track, Rosie slid into a completely different lane. Rick Ross started giving interviews about the long horizon. Rick Ross started talking about longevity. Rick Ross started dropping monologues about bot streams and artificial inflation and how the new flex is keeping the catalog pure. The energy read like a man saying, "I do not need to fight Curtis on his playing field because I am playing a bigger, quieter, longer game." In isolation, on paper, that framing actually worked for a slice of the culture. Rick Ross loyalists quoted it. Rick Ross loyalists screenshotted it. Rick Ross loyalists printed it across their timelines like a mantra. But here is what Rick Ross underestimated. Curtis does not respect composure. Curtis weaponizes it. The moment Rosie tried to float above the numbers conversation, 50 Cent zoomed in on every luxury flex Rick Ross had ever posted online and began disassembling them one at a time. On Instagram. In interviews. In that trademark low-hum laughing tone that always makes the target look angrier by comparison. It was scalpel clean. It was patient. It was honestly funny from the outside, even when you knew the man on the receiving end had to be seeing red. The features got mocked. The rollout got roasted. The catalog got picked apart. And then, right when the timeline assumed Curtis Jackson had run out of angles, the Mansion walked into the chat. This is the moment my jaw actually met the floor. Curtis Jackson pulled up on Instagram and told his followers that the $100 million estate Rick Ross had been photographing, filming, posting tours inside, and using as the crown jewel of the biggest boss branding was, in his framing, listed on Airbnb. Hold that frame in your mind. 50 Cent said in front of the entire hip-hop internet that the centerpiece of Rick Ross's public image was, in Curtis Jackson's telling, a short-term rental. Read that sentence twice, because it deserves the weight. Curtis said, in essence, everything is decoration. Not the music. Not the features. Not the streaming numbers. The house. The house Rick Ross has been building an aesthetic empire around for nearly 2 decades. The property that has anchored countless magazine spreads, music videos, and Slow Cigar Sunday morning uploads. You tracking the architecture behind the noise? Curtis did not attack the music this round. Curtis did not chase the features. 50 Cent aimed directly at the aesthetic, directly at the brand, directly at the visual identity Rick Ross has spent almost 20 years constructing brick by brick. In a single caption, Curtis Jackson tried to yank the ceiling down on the whole Rosie mythology in one motion. Because if the mansion is a rental, then what does the palm tree in the driveway actually represent? If the mansion is a rental, then how much of the entire luxury persona is real, and how much is a very expensive rolling photo shoot? Those are the exact questions that started ricocheting through every hip-hop timeline within minutes of Curtis Jackson posting the caption. And once a question like that hooks into the audience's brain, no press release, no counterpost, and no photo op can fully unhook it. Now, to Rick Ross's credit, Rosie absolutely did not swallow that shot in silence. Rick Ross fired back with a swing that on paper looked devastating. Rosie told the young hustlers in that slow, syrupy Miami cadence he has perfected that if he wanted to sell 250,000 units in a first week, he could have played that game. Rick Ross told them if he wanted 400,000, he could have bought that too. Rick Ross told them the artists Curtis was propping up could not even show a palm tree in their front yard while he was standing on a $100 million estate. On any other night, against any other opponent, that clapback would have been the mic drop of the week. But this is Curtis Jackson. 50 Cent does not react. Curtis reroutes. Curtis absorbs. Curtis studies. And then Curtis unloads. Because right when the culture was still chewing on the mansion volley, Curtis Jackson walked into a completely different interview and dropped what may end up being the most surreal announcement of his entire post-music pivot. 50 Cent looked into the camera, calm as a watchmaker reading a spring under a magnifier, and let the world know that Curtis has a brand new song locked and loaded for the upcoming Street Fighter movie soundtrack. And that this record features not just Curtis Jackson, not just Eminem, but Tupac. Yes, that Tupac. The Tupac Shakur who has been gone nearly 3 decades. The Tupac whose voice is arguably the most protected sonic archive in the entire history of American music. Not a sample. Not a nod. Not a ghostly interpolation. An actual feature verse threaded through the record. When the interviewer asked whether this was one of those synthetic voice reconstructions, Curtis shut that down on the spot. 50 Cent made it plain that no artificial reconstruction was used to conjure Tupac's vocals. Curtis Jackson explained that the Shakur estate approved the record, released previously unheard material for the project, and greenlit the full use. Curtis said the song was crafted specifically as the theme for the Street Fighter film. Curtis said the paperwork is real, the vocals are real, the process was collaborative, and the release is imminent. You could see it on Curtis Jackson's face while the clip was still rolling. 50 Cent knew exactly how nuclear that piece of information was the second it left his mouth. That was not a slip. That was a scheduled detonation time to land while the mansion smoke was still hanging in the air. Pause. Hold that frame in your mind. Curtis Jackson. Eminem. Tupac Shakur. One record. For a Street Fighter movie. If that song lands even half as hard as Curtis is teeing it up to land, we are staring at a widescreen cultural earthquake. Radio will rotate it. Streaming will pump it. TikTok will soundtrack every fight scene edit with it. Kids who have never sat down with a real Tupac verse in their lives will hear one for the first time and believe they are hearing something brand new. That is not a marketing beat. That is a generational event. And generational events do not happen on Rick Ross's timeline. They happen on Curtis Jackson's. Which circles the story home to Rick Ross. The second the Tupac announcement hit the timeline, Rosie had 100 moves he could have made. Rick Ross could have stayed silent. Rick Ross could have congratulated the collaboration diplomatically. Instead, Rick Ross grabbed his phone, opened Instagram, and swung what he clearly believed was a haymaker. Rosie mocked the collaboration. Rick Ross said Curtis Jackson was dropping a song with Eminem and a dead legend. Rick Ross told the internet Tupac had been resting for 30 years and to let the man rest in peace. Rosie mocked Marshall in the same breath. Rick Ross told Curtis to put those G-Unit sneakers on the clearance rack and go do a Tony Yayo and Lloyd Banks remix. Rosie laughed. Rosie smirked. Rosie filmed the whole thing in that laid-back Miami tone that has become his signature closing move. Now catch the strategic problem. Rick Ross did not attack the music. Rosie did not attack the collaboration on artistic ground. Rick Ross did not attack the timing, the marketing, the Street Fighter tie-in, or the technical craft. The biggest boss attacked the concept of a legacy artist being featured on a modern record, a swing that lands on absolutely no one. It does not land on Curtis Jackson, because 50 Cent did not make that decision alone. It does not land on the Shakur estate, because the estate has every legal and moral right to greenlight whatever fits their long-term stewardship. It does not land on the culture, because the culture is going to press play the second that record drops. If, and this is a serious if, the Shakur estate really did clear this record, that is not a mere greenlight. That is a coronation. And Rick Ross, in trying to shame Curtis Jackson for making the record, effectively placed himself in the far more dangerous position of shaming the Shakur family for approving it. You do not swing at that lineage in a public feud with 50 Cent while the entire internet is watching. That is not a jab. That is a self-inflicted wound Rick Ross may not even realize he is taking yet. You still stitching this together with me, because it sharpens from here. The instant Rick Ross ran his mouth about the Tupac record, Curtis Jackson did exactly what Curtis has been doing for 20 years. 50 Cent pivoted. Curtis did not defend the record. Curtis did not explain the estate paperwork. Curtis picked up an entirely different weapon and swung it right back at the mansion. That is the choreography. That is the rhythm Curtis Jackson has been perfecting since the mid-2000s. Right after Rosie ran the Tupac punchline, Curtis Jackson doubled down on the Airbnb storyline. 50 Cent essentially told the timeline, look at this man giving open house tours through a mansion allegedly listed as a short-term rental. Curtis essentially said, everything is decoration. And the internet dove into full detective mode. Threads appeared. Screenshots multiplied. Real estate agents got tagged. Some accounts insisted the property genuinely was a rental. Others insisted the estate was Rick Ross's real home and Curtis Jackson was bluffing. Nobody could conclusively prove either version in the moment. Crucially, nobody had to. Because the damage was already done. That has always been the play. Curtis Jackson does not need to prove anything. 50 Cent only needs to plant doubt. Once the doubt takes root, once the audience begins asking the question on their own, the whole persona begins bleeding oxygen. Every future mansion post from Rick Ross now carries a footnote. Every future flex now carries a whisper. Every future luxury photo drags a comment section full of Airbnb jokes behind it. That is what Curtis has been engineering for 2 decades. 50 Cent is not trying to defeat Rick Ross in an argument. 50 Cent is trying to compromise the audience's ability to take Rick Ross seriously. There is a canyon between those two objectives. You tracking the architecture behind the noise? The layering is the story. Piece 1, album sales. Piece 2, feature bloat. Piece 3, rollout theater. Piece 4, mansion authenticity. Piece 5, Tupac and Eminem collaboration. Piece 6, sneaker line versus sneaker line. Piece 7, the entire definition of what a real boss looks like inside the streaming era. Every piece is a fresh tunnel dug into the foundation of Rick Ross's public identity. And Rosie keeps swinging at whichever punch just landed instead of stepping back and reading the pattern behind the sequence. That is the trap. That is the entire trap. Back the camera up with me, because this next section is the one almost nobody has flagged, and it may end up being the most damaging exchange of the entire chapter. Curtis Jackson slipped in one of the sharpest character-level cuts of the entire feud. 50 Cent effectively reminded the culture that Rick Ross had, in his framing, thrown a black woman under the bus. Curtis called Rosie out for allegedly making excuses about being removed from certain shows and implied that the biggest boss placed the blame on the creator of those shows. Then Curtis Jackson dropped the line that has been quietly ricocheting through group chats ever since. Curtis said, "Be as loyal to the black woman as you have been to Eminem." Curtis said she gave you thousands of episodes of visibility. Curtis said the shows were her shows, the concepts were her concepts, and yet in his version, Rick Ross used a black woman as the fall guy while draping himself in undying loyalty to a white male superstar. That is not a punchline. That is a character indictment. That is the kind of statement that follows a public figure into every future interview for the next decade. That is the sort of accusation reporters will bring up in every green room from now until Rick Ross either directly addresses it or a piece of the audience decides silence is enough of an answer. Rick Ross, up to this point, has not directly answered that specific allegation. Not on his stories. Not on his podcast stops. Not on his verses. Rosie has deflected. Rosie has pivoted. Rick Ross has talked about longevity. Rick Ross has talked about bots. Rosie has talked about anything except that particular sentence. In a moment like this, silence reads as confirmation, whether it fairly should or not. And Curtis Jackson understands the volume of silence better than any veteran in this genre. Let me pull further in, because we still have not touched the sneaker war. Rick Ross took a shot at the G-Unit sneaker rollout. Rosie suggested those sneakers were destined for a wholesale clearance aisle. Rick Ross said he preferred the Lloyd Banks version. Rosie implied that the other G-Unit members did not even have real sneaker deals. Rick Ross added a punchline suggesting that with Freeway Ricky no longer happening anymore, Curtis Jackson could now focus on shoes. On the surface, that reads like a light pot shot. But when you zoom in, what Rosie is really doing is trying to fight Curtis Jackson on the entrepreneurial battlefield. A battlefield Curtis has completely dominated. Vitamin water. Effin' vodka. Sire spirits. Power. BMF. Ghost. Force. Boxing promotion. Podcast networks. Book publishing. The receipts on Curtis Jackson's business resume are Ivy League case study material. So when Rick Ross tries to poke at Curtis Jackson on the entrepreneurial side, Rosie is picking the single fight he is least likely to win. That is challenging a shark to a swim contest inside the shark's own ocean. That is walking into a boxing gym owned by the man you are trying to embarrass and asking him for a sparring session. Curtis understands that at a cellular level, which is exactly why every time Rosie fires on the business side, 50 Cent fires back on the persona side. Rosie throws a sneaker jab. Curtis throws a mansion jab. Rosie throws a features jab. Curtis throws an Airbnb jab. Rosie throws a longevity jab. Curtis throws a Tupac and Eminem announcement. Every exchange is Curtis Jackson escalating the stakes. 50 Cent is not defending the same ground. Curtis is climbing another floor every single round. That is not luck. That is design. That is engineering. That is a 2-decade playbook running at full velocity. Now here is where it flips one more time. There is a rumor traveling underneath the story I want to handle carefully. This is unverified. This is culture chatter, not confirmed reporting.
Whispers suggest that the Street Fighter soundtrack record may end up being previewed at a major event in the coming weeks.
If that turns out to be true, then the timing of Rick Ross's Tupac critique could not be worse.
The moment fans actually hear that record with their own ears.
The moment they hear a real Tupac verse cutting alongside a fresh Eminem bar and a Curtis Jackson verse over a cinematic Street Fighter instrumental. Every other conversation in this feud instantly becomes background static. The mansion debate becomes irrelevant. The album sales debate becomes irrelevant.
The long game monologues become irrelevant.
And Rick Ross, on his own Instagram, of his own free will, has already publicly criticized it. Which means the second the moment arrives, Rosie becomes the man who tried to talk the culture out of celebrating it. There is no more dangerous seed in hip-hop than being the person who publicly bet against the moment everyone ended up loving. That is a career footnote no future album can scrub. That is a caption that will follow Rick Ross through every retrospective, every documentary, every anniversary piece for the rest of his career.
Let me sit on the other side of the table for a beat. There is a legitimate, culturally sincere position that says some legends deserve to simply be left alone. There is a real argument that even with estate approval, even with previously recorded material, hearing Tupac dropped onto a modern soundtrack for a video game movie feels, to a slice of the culture, like a compromise of the legacy. Those are defensible positions. That is part of why Rick Ross's Tupac line resonated with a piece of the audience.
Because Rosie tapped into a real feeling, even if he tapped into it for the wrong reasons. But here is what the biggest boss missed. The strongest version of that argument does not arrive with a laugh track. It does not arrive with a court punchline attached. It does not arrive from a rapper who has been in public war with 50 Cent for more than a decade. The moment the message is welded to the messenger's grudge, the whole moral weight evaporates. That is Rick Ross's fundamental problem in this feud. Rosie keeps making valid points inside unusable vehicles. Rick Ross keeps loading real ammunition into a rusted rifle. If you go back and study Curtis Jackson's public playbook across the past 20 years, one pattern repeats with almost algorithmic reliability. Whenever 50 Cent is entering a new business phase, whenever a new film project is loading, whenever a new show is about to premiere, Curtis provokes a beef. Not a random beef. A calculated one. A beef with someone who has enough name recognition to trend, enough emotional volatility to respond, and enough audience overlap to guarantee eyeballs. Rick Ross checks every one of those boxes, which is exactly why, out of every possible target on Curtis Jackson's radar, Rosie is the one 50 Cent keeps returning to. Not because Curtis cannot let it go. Because it works. Every single time. It works. This round, the timing lines up almost too cleanly. A new song is coming. A movie tie-in is coming. A soundtrack is teased. Estate approvals are surfacing. A Street Fighter release is on the horizon. Every headline, every troll post, every meme, every mansion joke, every Airbnb caption is another organic ticker running beneath the screen, keeping Curtis Jackson's name in every conversation right up until the record drops. Rick Ross is providing free advertising for a project he has already publicly attacked. Every time you swing at Curtis Jackson, you are unintentionally holding up the poster for whatever 50 Cent is about to release. That is the paradox Rosie cannot see from inside the ring. Back the camera up with me one more time. This is not simply two veterans exchanging jabs. This is a live demonstration of how modern hip-hop celebrity actually functions inside the streaming era. In the streaming era, the rivalry became the rollout. The reaction is the marketing. The Instagram caption is the press release. Whoever masters that landscape dictates the culture. Curtis Jackson has spent a decade mastering that landscape. Rick Ross has spent a decade underestimating it. That gap right there is why we are here tonight. If you carry only one thing from tonight, carry this. Never confuse composure with strategy. Rick Ross has composure. Rosie has cadence. The biggest boss has that unmistakable Miami aesthetic that reads like power inside a still frame. But poise without a plan is only body language. You cannot posture your way past Curtis Jackson. 50 Cent will locate the crack. Curtis will find the seam. Curtis will surface the rental listing.
Curtis will surface the loyalty gap. Curtis will surface the Tupac angle.
Curtis will surface the sneaker soft spot.
50 Cent will lift whatever is closest to the surface into the light with a laughing emoji.
Then Curtis will do it again the next day, until the target either responds emotionally and hands him more material, or goes silent and hands him the appearance of surrender.
Do not expect this feud to cool anytime near.
One Instagram post from either side is all it takes to reignite the entire loop.
This story does not have an ending. This story has episodes. Based on the pacing, we are, at best, mid-season.
And mid-season is when the real damage gets done, because both men are locked in, both men have too much invested to walk away, and both audiences are watching too closely for either side to fold quietly.
Which brings me to the final thought.
Beneath all the memes, beneath all the trolling, there is a real question buried inside this rivalry.
What does longevity actually look like when the numbers stop cooperating? Does longevity look like Rick Ross digging into the long game, leaning on the catalog, leaning on the image? Or does longevity look like Curtis Jackson pivoting into Hollywood, television, franchise soundtracks, whatever medium keeps his name inside the algorithm? Those are the exact questions every veteran currently inside his 40s and 50s is asking himself right now. Both models have defenders. Both models have critics.
But what we are watching in real time is the war between those two models being played out with two of the loudest personalities the genre has ever produced. Every jab, every mansion crack, every Tupac announcement, every Airbnb caption is only a proxy skirmish inside that larger philosophical conflict. That is what makes this rivalry refuse to die.
It is not really about Curtis. It is not really about Rose. It
is about which version of veteran hip-hop success is going to define the next 10 years of this culture. Whichever man wins the narrative wins the blueprint.
Here is the piece that keeps me pacing at night.
The thing Curtis Jackson understands, that Rick Ross either cannot or will not accept, is that inside the modern attention economy, being talked about is more valuable than being right. Being trending is more valuable than being correct. Being unforgettable is more valuable than being universally liked.
Curtis Jackson does not care if half the internet decides he is petty.
50 Cent cares that all of the internet is paying attention. Every single time Rose dignifies a jab with a response, he is voluntarily stepping into a room Curtis Jackson has already loaded.
Curtis Jackson is not fighting for the win. 50 Cent is fighting for the narrative. Whoever controls the narrative, controls the story. Whoever controls the story, controls the algorithm.
Whoever controls the algorithm, controls the culture.
And whoever controls the culture writes the terms of what the next chapter of hip-hop actually looks like. There is another wrinkle almost nobody in the timeline is pausing to weigh. When Curtis Jackson leans into a franchise soundtrack, he is not gambling with an album cycle.
He is threading himself into a piece of intellectual property with a built-in global audience, a global marketing budget, and a global theatrical release. Street Fighter is not a niche project. Street Fighter is one of the most recognizable game franchises on planet Earth, and the film built around it will arrive with a promotional campaign the average album could never afford.
So when 50 Cent stitched his name into the theme song, Curtis Jackson did not just book a feature.
Curtis Jackson strapped himself to a rocket the studio was already going to launch. That is why Rick Ross's clapback about clearance aisle sneakers reads as cosmically off-target.
Rose is critiquing a mall while Curtis Jackson is boarding a spacecraft. Rick Ross has spent the better part of a decade telling audiences that longevity is the real flex.
That framing is not wrong on its own.
Longevity absolutely matters.
But longevity without motion becomes preservation, and preservation without oxygen becomes decoration.
Curtis Jackson has kept moving. Rick Ross has kept posing.
And every time the biggest boss releases another luxurious static frame while Curtis Jackson releases another moving asset with cinematic reach, the distance between the two men widens. Watch how the marketing physics actually work here. When Curtis Jackson mentions the Street Fighter record, that phrase carries 3 separate keywords that the recommendation system loves.
Curtis Jackson. Tupac Shakur. Eminem.
Rick Ross responds and adds a 4th keyword to the conversation.
Rick Ross himself. Every reaction video that follows is now stacking 4 legendary names into a single search cluster. Every algorithm on every platform starts feeding that cluster into more feeds. And Curtis Jackson, by design, sits at the center of the cluster because he is the connective tissue. Rick Ross is not fighting on his own terms. Rosie is fighting inside a semantic web Curtis Jackson has already spun. Zoom in on the mansion angle one more time, because there is a subplot inside it that has not been dissected properly. Even if the property is not, in reality, an Airbnb, even if Curtis Jackson is stretching the framing for engagement value, the mere fact that the internet spent 48 hours investigating a possible listing means the mansion narrative has been fractured. And fracture, not falsification, is the goal of a Curtis Jackson media campaign. Rick Ross does not need every fan to believe the estate is a rental. Rosie only needs a critical mass of fans to entertain the possibility, and the aura loses its shine. That is the same tactic Curtis Jackson used against Ja Rule 2 decades ago. That is the same tactic 50 Cent used against Diddy across the last 3 years. Curtis Jackson does not need to knock the target out. Curtis Jackson only needs to introduce enough grit into the target's mythology that every future flex feels slightly less believable. That is not violence. That is corrosion. And corrosion applied consistently over enough news cycles eventually eats through even the sturdiest brand. Rick Ross has an opening here, if Rosie would take it. The path back to the high ground is not through counter-punching, and it is not through denial. The path is through demonstration. If the mansion is truly Rick Ross's private residence, a single unedited walkthrough with dated documentation would close the loop in a night. But every hour Rosie avoids that clean demonstration, the doubt hardens. And the longer the doubt hardens, the more the doubt becomes the accepted background truth of Rick Ross's public image. That is how narratives ossify in the streaming era. They do not need a final verdict. They only need a long enough silence. There is also a generational reading to all of this that deserves attention. The audience that grew up on Curtis Jackson's original run, the audience that made Get Rich or Die Tryin' one of the defining albums of a decade, is now the audience with buying power, streaming budgets, subscription decisions, and cultural gatekeeping influence. That audience is not tuning into Rick Ross for a Miami cigar montage anymore. That audience is tuning into Curtis Jackson for a boxing card, a scripted drama, a documentary, a business masterclass. Rick Ross has, in the eyes of that audience, aged into a static icon. Curtis Jackson has aged into a moving executive. Both aging pathways are valid, but only one of them is compounding. And now Curtis Jackson is spending that compounding cultural capital directly against Rick Ross, in real time, with maximum leverage. Every troll post is not just a joke. Every troll post is an equity deployment. 50 Cent is spending built-up cultural capital in a targeted burn that lowers Rick Ross's stock and raises his own by the same motion. The trolling is the strategy. The strategy is the marketing. The marketing is the business. And the business is the long game Curtis Jackson is playing at scale. You cannot fight that with a slow, syrupy monologue about longevity. Longevity is a lagging indicator. Motion is a leading indicator. Curtis Jackson is leading. Rick Ross is lagging. That is not an insult. That is a diagnosis. And diagnoses can be corrected, but only if the patient acknowledges the chart. Now walk this next thought with me, because it is the piece the reaction pages will not touch. There is a psychological asymmetry between Curtis Jackson and Rick Ross that no amount of PR polish can undo. Curtis Jackson wakes up looking for opponents. Rick Ross wakes up looking for reassurance. Curtis Jackson treats a bad news day as raw material. Rick Ross treats a bad news day as a personal wound. That is not moral judgment. That is temperament. And temperament decides who survives a modern feud. The internet does not reward the man who feels the deepest. The internet rewards the man who feels the coldest. Curtis Jackson is ice water. Rick Ross is warm cognac. You know which one wins the 72-hour timeline. Zoom out one more level, because there is a piece of this puzzle that goes beyond either man. The truth is, the entire industry is watching this feud like it is a training video. Every artist over 40 is taking notes. Every manager is drawing up new decks. Every publicist is rewriting their crisis playbook. Because whatever pattern emerges from this exchange between Curtis Jackson and Rick Ross will get copied, refined, and redeployed across every legacy artist rollout for the next decade. That is the second-order value of what we are watching. It is not just a rivalry. It is a case study being written in real time. Sit with the weight of the CTA for a moment, because the CTA is where the audience gets to bend the story. Drop your read in the comments. Do you think Rick Ross should have stayed silent on the Tupac record? Do you think Curtis Jackson has pushed the trolling past the line? Do you think the Airbnb mansion claim is real, or is 50 Cent bluffing for engagement? Do you believe the Tupac verse actually sees daylight, or does the Shakur estate quietly pull the plug once the internet pushes back? Do you think Rick Ross ever recovers this narrative? Or is Rosé's brand permanently dented no matter what the biggest boss releases next? Whatever you read, drop it below. Let the comments section debate it, because I read every single response, and half of my next breakdown starts inside your replies. If you want the follow-up the second the next round of shots fires, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, turn notifications on, because when this next chapter drops, I do not want you finding out about it from a random blog with half the details. I want you finding out about it from me with all of them. Every receipt. Every screenshot. Every angle. Every hidden layer nobody else is willing to walk you through. Because the second Curtis Jackson posts again, the second Rick Ross responds again, the second the Street Fighter record leaks, the second the Shakur estate releases a statement, the second an interview clip surfaces, this whole story shifts another degree. And you deserve a guide who can read that shift in real time and translate it into the pattern behind the pattern. One last frame before we close the reel. Curtis Jackson has already turned this into a moving billboard, and Rick Ross keeps painting new letters on it. Every hour Rosé stays angry is another hour 50 Cent stays trending. Every mansion post is another Airbnb comment thread. Every Tupac critique is another Street Fighter search cluster. Curtis Jackson is not chasing Rick Ross. Curtis Jackson is farming him. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Take care of the people who take care of you. I will meet you back here on the next breakdown, at the edge of the next chapter, one frame ahead of the feed.